Okay, so then it is my absolute pleasure to be welcoming all of you to this Sport&EU short talk on the very timely topic of athlete representation. And it is especially my big pleasure to be welcoming such a distinguished panel of speakers for the next 90 or so minutes. And before we delve right into the debate with our guests, I would like to introduce every one of our speakers. And before we do that, just a brief reminder, some housekeeping. Everyone not speaking, please keep your microphone muted. Please use the chat function to raise questions, or when we come to the open question rounds, please also use the raise your hand function as which you find in the lower end of the WebEx application. If someone unmutes himself or herself for some reason, Ekain will also take control and try to make sure that we have a good discussion, and will also mute people again. So without any further ado, let me introduce our four panelists of today. First off, I'd like to introduce Camille Desondes. Camille has a long professional career working for and with elite athletes. She is the advisor to the president at Union Nationale des Footballeurs Professionnels, UNFEP, the French Football Players Union, where she's working since 2013. Since 2017, she's also a board member of EU Athletes, the umbrella organization of athletes associations and player unions at the European level. Second in line, we have Alistair Brownlee, and we could probably use the 90 minutes just to list the sporting successes of Alistair, but I decided to keep it with double Olympic champion and four-time world champion in triathlon. If you're interested in his outstanding sporting career, you'll certainly find much on the internet. Since 2021, Alistair is an elected member of the European Olympic Committee's Athletes Commission, and in 2022 he was appointed to the IOC's Athletes Commission by IOC President Thomas Bach. So thank you, Alistair, for joining us today. Next in line, Topias Kukkola. He's a Finnish athlete in the sport of athletics. He specializes in the long and triple jump and has won several national titles. He is the chair of the Finnish Athletes Association, an independent organization representing the voice of Finnish elite athletes in the sport of athletics. Thanks, Topias, for joining us today from Finland. And before we get to this outstanding panel of athletes, it is my great pleasure to also introduce Dr. Andy Harvey. Andy is a professional and interdisciplinary scholar working on a variety of topics related to the governance of sport. Today, Andy will represent a team of researchers and practitioners currently involved in an EU-funded project, which is called Strengthening Athlete Power in Sport, or the acronym SAPIS. I'm really grateful to Andy for kicking off this event by providing us with some insights into their findings of the project. So Andy, the floor is yours, and you can gladly also share your slides.
Thank you very much. I'm just going to bring the slides up. Hopefully everybody can see those. Yes. So first of all, Maxi, thank you very much for inviting me to this short talk event, and I'm grateful for you to let me go first, as you say, to be able to provide a bit of a framework before we hear some of the more detailed, granular the talks from our athletes and others. As you said, I have been one of the researchers on the EU-funded project Strengthening Athlete Power in Sport, which is now in its fourth year, having had a one-year extension due to COVID. The project aims, although there are three of them, they're broadly into two categories. The first aim was to try to just understand the landscape of athlete representation, understand what types of athlete representatives there are and how they are organized in the sporting environment, and in order to be able to really sort of be able to understand what opportunities currently exist for athletes to participate in that decision making. And alongside that, the second part of that was to map the existing structures and practices. So there was a fair amount of what we could call fairly descriptive work involved in just understanding what there is already out there in terms of athlete representation. But there is also a normative element to the project, which is also to try to look at ways in which how legitimate strengthening of capacity of athletes to take part in decision making might come about, and what's needed to enable that to happen. So there's two elements, a descriptive element and a normative element. I won't talk too much about the methods, but of course, as you know, they are of course critical to be able to these sorts of projects. We had a comprehensive literature review of democratic theory and athlete representation in sports, and that's now been published on the Play the Game website for anybody who wishes to download it, in order to provide a conceptual framework in which to understand athlete representation.
Sorry, Andy, to be interrupting. The slides haven't switched yet, so maybe you need to go full screen or sorry.
Okay, sorry, I don't know why they haven't switched. So let me try to share my screen again. Can you see them switching now?
Yes. If you want to go full screen mode, then it's perfect.
Well, I was already full screen mode, and you couldn't see them switch. So if I stick with where I am, then
okay.
Then perhaps that works better. So so you can now see. Can you now see the slide called methods?
Yes.
Great.
Yes.
Okay. So the second part of the methods was a large survey of athlete representatives. That was conducted primarily by our colleagues at Utrecht University, and there's a quantitative survey which went and was returned by about 250 representatives of all different types. We also have had an examination and a review of good practice in other sectors to try to look at what happens elsewhere in employment relations, to see whether or not, to what extent there might be some ways of working for athlete representation that can be brought in from other sectors, so some lessons learned from there. And finally, and the bits which I've been heavily involved in, being qualitative interviews with members of athletes commissions, athletes association officers, including Camille, thank you very much, and international sports federations. So a fairly comprehensive set of methods by which to try to understand the landscape of athlete representation. So we're still in the process of really sort of working out exactly what we've found and what it all means, but we're just in the process of doing that. And what I've done here is just take think about 8 sort of major lessons that I personally think are perhaps the most important ones. But these, of course, need also to be confirmed and validated by the stakeholders and by other project partners. But I think we're getting sort of more or less to what we think are going to be the most important aspects to take forward. The first, and this is certainly critical from my perspective, is that only athlete trade unions can offer a genuinely independent collective voice, and that's the important point, collective voice for athletes, or engage in collective bargaining and negotiations on terms and conditions of employment. So I think we would think it's really important that this is sort of foundational, that there needs to be this independent collective voice, and trade unions, as indeed in other sectors of the economy, other sectors of society, are the organisations that are able to provide that. Something that you'll obviously be very aware of, Maxi, that, and because I think it very speaks to your employers project, is that under the principles of social dialogue and good governance, sports governing bodies and sports employers should recognise independent athlete trade unions and associations as the rightful collective representative body for athletes. So I think it's very important. I think there needs to be quite a bit of work done still with sports governing bodies and sports employers, that that they shouldn't be afraid of this idea of recognising the independent voice of athletes. That it's something that happens elsewhere in the economy, and it's something that we think that should be something that they should take on board willingly as improving good governance and meeting the requirements of social dialogue. However, we also believe, or seem to have found, that athlete commissions can provide an important complementary role to athlete trade unions, but critically, they should not be used by sports governing bodies as a means to sidestep athlete trade unions' right to collective bargaining. So we think that there's actually a really important role for athletes commissions, a role that that trade unions can't necessarily provide or can't necessarily meet, but that requires a certain amount of goodwill here by sports governing bodies to really understand that we've got two separate types of representative body, and that they shouldn't use athletes commissions as a means to sidestep or evade their responsibilities in respect of recognising trade unions. And as a sort of a corollary to that, also an extension of that, we found that through some of the case studies that we've been developing, that where the different functions of athletes trade unions and athletes commissions are clearly defined, then there's no reason why working in partnership cannot provide positive results for athlete representation. So in other words, we're able to see that, that trade unions and athletes commissions are really two quite separate sort of bodies. Yes, there may be some overlaps in terms of responsibilities, but they sort of sit in very different parts of the ecosystem, and as such have different sort of perspectives, I think, in relation to athlete representation, and can provide two different types of function, at least two different types. And I think related again to that, although there's obviously some debate about the extent to which we want, even more so like forums, which may be little more than talking shops, a theme that's come out of the interviews is that creating a recurring forum, this is by sports governing bodies, in which the different types of athletes representative bodies are invited, is beneficial for sharing and exchanging good practices. And certainly some of the, what we found from the interviews was that athlete representatives really welcome this idea, or this ability to be able to share good practice and hear from others about what's going on in their sport, their country, their region. Very important, perhaps this third point in this particular slide, athlete trade unions and associations, clearly to be the collective voice, they need to ensure that they have legitimacy of representative status. And this concept of legitimacy has really been something that's come through the project very strongly, this need for legitimacy to make sure that they can say with good evidence that they are the collective voice of athletes and represent the collective view. And this can be achieved through processes such as elections of officers, active engagement with members, and strong and consistent communication with members. So very important, this idea that trade unions and athletes associations must be seen and ensure that they are the legitimate voice. And finally, the last two lessons is that in terms of athletes commissions, these should be operationally independent of the international sports federations or sports governing bodies. So whilst they may be internal representative bodies to the sports federations, that they should be operationally independent, should have their own separate way of working and separate constitution, and should be able to operate independently of the governing body itself. Therefore, to be able to provide that independent voice of athletes. And in order to be able to give that effect, to implement that, then to create an athlete-centered system of sport, members of athletes commissions should be included in subcommittees and working groups within the federation. So in other words, it's not enough just to be able to sit on the main board. There needs to be sort of like a much greater involvement and engagement with the sort of more detailed work that takes place in sports governing bodies, so that the voice is heard at lots of different levels and not necessarily just at the top level. So I hope I've managed to keep to time, Max. I wasn't timing myself, but hopefully I've been okay. And those are just some provisional preliminary lessons, so they still need to be validated by the stakeholders, but hopefully they'll provide some food for thought for our discussion today. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Andy. Much appreciated. And I think you have already pointed at many different aspects that will definitely play a role throughout the next minute. So there is a complex ecosystem of elite sport. There is many different stakeholders involved, and there's different solutions. And so we have different organizations and representatives with us today, and I'm sure we will have also questions addressed to you. So now I would like really to pass the floor to our three athlete representatives. We have asked all of them to briefly present the organization they represent and to answer the following question. In your view, what are the requirements for an effective representation of the athlete's interests in sport? And with this, I would like to give it to Camille and ask for her response to this question and a brief introduction of your organization.
Okay, thanks, Maximilian, and thanks for introducing ourselves earlier. As you said, so I work for UNFP, which is the French Football Players Union. So we are a trade union, and I think thanks to Andy's previous words, you all get the idea of what we do daily. So we represent about, I would say, 2,000 football players, professional men and women. Just to a quick reminder, we represent workers, we represent football players that have a working contract. And so this is why we are a trade union, and we are currently negotiating for them the CBA, collective bargaining agreement, which deals with their working conditions. Okay, so as you said, I'm the advisor from a legal point of view of the strategy of the union and of the strategy of the negotiations of the CBA. Regarding the question about the requirements of the effective representation, I think Andy said almost all what I wanted to say, but I'll try to say it again. First of all, to us, one of the most important things is the independence. Maybe I can go a bit further than what you said, Andy, because independence means a lot of things. The first one is independence from the governing bodies themselves, meaning for professional sports from the federation and from the league, who are in charge of organizing the competition. Independence from the employers themselves, because they have a working relationship with them, which is it doesn't allow them to represent the athletes properly. And also economic independence of the organization that represents the athletes, because it allows you to have your own opinion and not depending on any economic logic that would make you not able to make the choice that you would have made otherwise. So independence is one of the most important requirements to me and to the organization that I represent to have this effective representation. I also think that there is a question of legitimacy that you have to ask. It is easy to answer for a trade union because this is what you have been constituted for. But then, to be honest, it's a real question here in France, as we're talking about strikes. Do the trade unions are legitimate to represent the workers that they're supposed to represent? So I think that one of the criteria that is most important to be legitimate is the number of members you represent and the proportion of athletes that are members of the union. If you represent only 5%, even if you're legally entitled to represent them, maybe you're not considered as legitimate as you could be. So this is also, I think, an important question that should be pointed. And this legitimacy comes also with the proximity that you should have with the athletes to be able to speak on their behalf. You have to know them and to work closely with them. So these are, to me, the three most important requirements to have this proper and effective representation. That's it for me. If you.
Thank you very much, Camille. Yeah, I think we will pick up on the points that you mentioned throughout the discussion. So I would like to pose the same question and the same request to Alistair. Please briefly introduce the organization you represent or the body, and then share your thoughts on the requirements for an effective representation of the athlete's interest.
Hi, I'm Alistair. I represent athletes now solely across the Olympic movement. So that is on pretty much every level. So being on the IOC Athletes Commission, European Olympic Committee's Athlete Commission, and I sit as part of my National Olympic Committee, the British Olympic Committee, on their Athletes Commission. In the past, I have actually represented athletes in other parts of the sport, such as an independent private triathlon body called the Professional Triathletes Organisation that's privately funded, and a very different way of representing athletes that maybe we could talk about more in the future later on, which is interesting. Technically, if you're in the IOC Athletes Commission, you're representing all the athletes of the Olympic movement. In fact, every single athlete, 10,000 of them or so in the Summer Olympic Games, and I think 3,000 or 4,000 in the Winter Olympic Games, has a chance to represent, to vote for their commission members. I actually didn't finish in the top 4 of the vote. I think I finished 6th, and then was appointed by Thomas back to the commission. I think the commission can be made up of 23 people in total, just over half of which are actually voted, and so 12 can be voted and 11 technically could be appointed. So the balance is athletes that are voted on, and yeah, obviously your job is to represent athletes from across the Olympic movement, independent of the country they represent, the sport they do, where they're from. The European Olympic committees is the Olympic movement body that covers the European NOCs and has the responsibility of organising the Europe-focused events such as obviously the European Games and the European Youth Olympic Games, summer and winter. The winter has just been going on in the last few weeks, and obviously every country has their own NOC. Actually, not every country has their own NOC Athletes Commission. It's one of the big driving forces of the IOC Athletes Commission and wider to firstly make sure that every National Olympic Committee has a functioning Athletes Commission, and there is grant money to do it, and support from the Athletes Commission and the commission bodies to do that for obviously important representation and governance reasons. And you know, as you can imagine, in Europe, pretty much all, I think there's only one NOC that doesn't have a Athletes Commission that is run technically in the right way. In the African continent, for example, there's a lot more. So I very much see my job as representing athletes. I think a couple fold actually, representing athletes from and across the Olympic movement. I think representing, I think it's always important to remember with the IOC, you know, there's the various spheres of influence and what they stand for. They're the organisation that organised the Olympic Games. They're an organisation in themselves in terms of a kind of a corporate body employing hundreds of people, mostly in Lausanne. And thirdly, they are the holders and I guess the promoters of the Olympic movement, Olympism. And as someone who's been an athlete my whole life and was inspired watching the Olympic Games as an 8-year-old, and then as a 12-year-old watching my sport of triathlon making its debut in Sydney, I take that final point of the philosophical point of Olympism and the fact that inspirational and motivational effect of young people everywhere, and representing that to the wider community, but also trying to represent that in the right way to fellow athletes as well. Seriously, so it does go both ways. And in terms of requirements, I think independence is important. Obviously, independence when you're working as an athlete commission member as part of an organisation is very different from a separate trade union, but independence in terms of right of thought, right to make statements. An example of that recently could be, and this has happened across lots of athlete commissions, taking a slightly separate stance on the biggest issue probably in Olympic sport at the moment, which is re-inclusion of Russian athletes in international competition. And I've seen a number of National Olympic Committee athlete commissions have a different stance and release a different press release to their NOC, which is interesting. I think also being independent, commercial and political independence is important. Always remembering you're there to represent athletes, not the commercial aspects of what might be going on with the wider organisation. I think the diversity of the commission is important. That's actually one of the reasons for the appointees in the IOC Athletes Commission, for example, to be diverse across regions, sports, genders across the world. It's a hell of a diverse constituency that you're trying to represent. So obviously that's important. And I think representation up the chain of governance. I mean, this one is kind of self-explanatory. There wouldn't be a lot of point talking and deciding things between athletes if that wasn't then included higher up in the chain of government, right up to executive board level, which the IOC guidelines in their governance across themselves and the NOC guidelines is quite clear on. And yeah, that's everything from me.
Thanks a lot, Alistair. So I think, Tobias, there's been a lot of food for thought already, but I'll still give the floor to you to share your vision and the role of your organization and your opinion on what the requirements for an effective representation of the athletes' interests are.
Yeah. Thanks a lot, Maximilian, and thanks for the invitation. Pleasure to be here. I will share one PowerPoint slide. Yeah, can you see it? Can you see this slide?
Yes.
Yes?
Yes, we can see
perfect. Yes, perfect. Okay, yes. So I'm here to represent Finnish Athletics Association called Yleisurheilijat ry in Finnish language. So it's freely translated Finnish Athletics Association. Our association was founded in December 2021. So 2022 was the first starting year to our association. We had two main operational purposes in our association. The first one and the most important is that we represent Finnish national team athletes in the representative bodies of Finnish Athletics Association. And I have to underline that track and field athletes we represent. So, for example, we have representations in 5 Finnish Athletics Association committees, Ethical Committee, International Relations Committee, Organization Committee, which handles, for example, proposals to rule changes or something like that, Competition Committee, and Coaching Committee. And in the last autumn, we get membership to the Finnish Athletics Association board, and we get the second representative in the later of this year. And in addition of Finnish Athletics Association representative bodies, we represent, for example, bodies which handle cooperation of athletes and athletes representative. For example, we started last year a cooperation with Finnish Football Association and Finnish Ice Hockey Association. In addition to representation, we also promote and help athletes practice their profession as an athlete. This means that we organize seminars, education events, create instructions to athletes, etc. Seminars, for example, we organize how to use social media channels, instructions to competition negotiation, for example, competition fees and rewards, and maybe in the future also we offer juridical help and instruction to athletes. Today we have around 100 members and around 400 potential members who fulfill our membership criteria. And yes, here's our logo, and you can find us on social media channels in Instagram and Twitter. And here's our website. Unfortunately, website is only in Finnish and Swedish language now, but I think we have to translate also into English also. Yes, that's the slide. How can I get this off? Is that? Well, Is this slide
I can
off?
stop it for you.
Okay, yeah, thanks a lot. Thanks for helping, Maximilian. So, and the and the later part, what are the requirements for an effective representation of the athletes' interest in sport? I think that the first and the most important part is that athletes representative body or body represents athletes collectively. I got an example. Early in the Finnish Athletics Association, in the committees had own athletes representations, and this worked like committees called athletes representations personally, and they and their opinions handled only their own perspective. So athletics representations didn't represent athletics collectively at all, and for example didn't have any accountability of other athletes of their decisions. And we have organized and solved this kind of problem. The found like association, Finnish Athletics Association. Then we can get collectively opinions of the national team track and field athletes. And we, for example, organize polls, discussion with other board members of our association and something like that. And our opinions, association opinions and statements, for example, they are not anymore a single athlete opinion in the representative body. And this is also the thing why our athletics, why our federation have noticed us, and they have to notice athletes' opinions very seriously, because our voice is a track and field athletes' collective voice. Yeah. And the second part, I think this is taken for granted, but I see that athletes have to be active on this kind of area. I think this is the crucial demand, because even though, for example, federation creates the frameworks and representative positions, the placements are useless if athletes are not active. And as active athlete, I mean that representative athletes have to organize in some way, and B, athletes have to orientate or familiarize the things and issues regarding to this area. And I think this is not the easiest point, because this kind of promotion of interest things and issues, there are not simple issues, and athletes need to have interest in these kind of things and get time to think and take out of the issues, create opinions alongside their sport career. And that's not the easiest part, because there are no simple things. There are so complex things, and athletes need time to get used and take information and think about opinions of that. But I think also that as our association form is good solution to this, because for example we can create a lot of opinions, for example of our board members, and single representatives doesn't have to create the wheel again and again and think opinions and statements alone. And in addition to this, association enables to share responsibilities and representations to different bodies. For this sort of opening and to the later discussion, I think that everything handled out, that I'm in the association side of this discussion. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you very much for this insight and this overview. And since your organization is just so young, and we have touched on so many different big words like the mobilization of athletes, accountability, independence, legitimacy, I would continue asking you, how did the organization evolve? Where did the impetus come from to start the organization? And how today are you making sure as an athlete representative and a collective organization that you not only represent the opinion of the elected representatives, but of the whole athlete constituency? And this question will then also go to Camille and to Alistair.
Yeah, good question. For the background of the association, a little bit before track and field national championships in Finland in 2021, Ella Junnila, European indoor champs, bronze medalist in women's high jump, called me and asked that how could be sound of athletes' own promotion of interest association, like Finnish Athletics Association. And I got interested immediately. We planned a presentation to traditional Finland-Sweden match, and reception among athletes was very good. And then we started the constitution work, and officially association founded in 2021 in December. Yeah. So how we get the main idea, this kind of association, we both, me and Ella, we were a little bit frustrated that there was no collective voice in Finnish track and field team. So, and we also noticed that on the Finnish track and field playground, there were a lot of grievances in Finnish track and field playground, and I think that athletes had no channel to announce this kind of grievances. So that was the main point and key thing why we thought about that this kind of associations is very necessary to build up. And in addition of that, it also helped that our federation, Finnish Athletics Federation, gave support to us. So it helped a lot in the starting point to create this association. Yeah.
Thanks a lot.
Okay. Yeah. That was a little background of the Finnish Athletics Association. Yeah.
Yeah. So Alistair, you mentioned that the aim of the IOC Athletes Commission is to represent the interest of all athletes, all elite athletes in Olympic sports, obviously from a certain level. So how, as an athlete representative or as an athlete representative body, does the IOC Athletes Commission make sure that it does in fact represent the interests and the voices of all of these athletes that constitute their main addressees?
Yeah, well, I'd say that's one of the roles of the Athletes Commission. One of the other roles, for example, as I said, was I think representing the values of Olympism and the Olympic movement. Another one of the roles is, I think, like all organisations, increasingly taking the welfare and well-being of athletes out of the sporting field more seriously. Health, mental health, post-career opportunities, working towards those things. So they're just a couple of the other things. But back to the difficult question of how do they represent all the athletes of the Olympic movement? I think a couple of ways, and obviously this is effectively a political, philosophical question of are you going off your kind of own opinions, and you're put there to think very carefully and have your own opinions and stuff, or are you going out and canvassing for support? And in truth, it's a bit of both. Sit around and talk about issues, both anecdotally and not. Quite often for me, I might sit and talk about an issue with my NOC, the BOA Athletes Commission, which is fed in from the British athletes, and I can feed that into the IOC Athletes Commission, and that's direct democracy. In other cases, you might have seen the Athletes Commission and the Athletes Department hold major consultations on issues. I think probably the big famous two in the last few years are the consultations on Rule 40 and Rule 50. So Rule 50 is the right to protest, and there was a big consultation on that prior to Tokyo, and the changes came in for Tokyo off the back of that consultation, which I think had thousands, 3,000, 4,000, 5,000, I can't remember the figures off the top of my head, of people replying to the online questionnaire that was part of the consultation that went on to feed the results, and effectively that changed the Olympic Charter in Rule 50.2, I think.
Before I get back to Tobias, I would ask Camille, how is the practice in the French Football Players Association, and maybe even in EU Athletes, which is an umbrella association representing the voice of I don't know how many thousand athletes?
Yeah, so here in France, the union exists for more than 60 years. So the question today is not the same as it used to be 60 years ago about how do you manage to engage athletes in this commitment, defending and representing the rights of collective football players. So I think the question is not the same as it used to be honest, and it's not the same for women today, women athletes that only start being professional for a few years, than it is for the men. So the question could be answered differently only on how do you make sure that you represent the athletes. But on a daily work, we have a board member of both current players, former players, and employees who are in charge of making sure that we are still in touch with the players that are playing today and that we know what their current problems are and that we are still close to what they think. Because as you pointed, the main danger for us, as we are kind of a big association here in France, is to make sure that we still know who the players are. And we do not just rely on ourselves and what we've been doing forever. So this is one of the main dangers that we are facing. Yeah.
Thanks. I saw, Tobias, you raised your hand, so please.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Interesting slides for Alistair and Camille. Sorry, I didn't answer yet how I ensure that that I'm not only representing my own opinion, but that many athletes as possible. Well, I said earlier, we have solved this to create this kind of association, and I think we have very good and active communication with our board, and regularly we collect opinions from our members, especially from some big issues. So we have to this day we have organized polls. We send membership letters on email. WhatsApp group is active, and we use also Instagram for our internal communication. But as a chair of board of Finnish Athletics Association, I'm the final accountable person to opinions of the association. And in some point, I think it's quite complicated because active athletics representations doesn't want to be only a spokesman without their own opinions in, for example, in Finnish athletics committees. So we have discussed with our board that, for example, in the committees, representatives, of course, are allowed and welcome to present their own opinions, but some big and crucial issues is crucial that opinions which they present are collective association voice. So, and I think this has worked very, very, very fine at least at that point. And yeah, you asked also, is this important for all? I think it's a crucial point because then you can say that voice is athletics voice. Then we ensure that voice is a collective voice. Yeah.
I mean, I'll let you respond directly.
Yeah, I just wanted to add that, as you know, football is a team sport. So saying that it is another kind of discussion to that Tobias pointed about the fact that you could represent collective interests. I mean, in team sports, you already have this culture of having at least one or two people of the team representing the others. So for each team, you already have this. It's easier to have access to one or two already representing a small group, and then you can have groups representing groups. So I think the discussion is not exactly the same if you talk of team sports or individual sports. Just wanted to add that.
Thank you. Andy, from all the data you gathered from the surveys you had, from the interviews you carried out, is there any common theme about the question of how to effectively represent the opinions of the constituency as an athlete representative?
Yes, indeed. Thanks, Maxi. I mean, I suppose one of the words I would use here is the fact that athlete representatives, whether they be trade unions or commissions, need to make sure that they are relevant to the interests of the people the athletes they seek to represent. I think that relevance is of two types. You know, we found that there's a political relevance, which is making sure that the issues that the representatives take to the governing bodies, take to the employers, are very much those issues that are affecting the working lives of the athletes. That's very important. How do you do that? Well, I think as everybody said, it's about communication. It's about visiting in team sports, the dressing rooms. It's about being able to speak to people who are in your sport, finding out what their issues are, what their concerns are, what their interests are, what their desires are. That takes quite a lot of time, I think. And this is one thing, of course, which is somewhat problematic. It's quite resource intensive, this sort of approach. And there's technological ways of doing this through WhatsApp groups and other social media interventions and surveys and polls. So there's all those sort of techniques that can be used, but it's really critical. And I think from the sports governing body's perspective, this is also important because they want to know that the person they're speaking to is representing the collective views of athletes as they are saying so. And I think that's very important from their perspective. You know, they don't want to be speaking to someone who's just talking about their own issues. They want to talk. They want to know they're speaking to someone who has taken the time and effort to find out what the collective view is. It's really important. So that's one side of relevance. The other side of relevance, I think, and Alistair started to touch on this and others, and to pass as well, is that if you're going to build membership, and I think that's critical, as Camille said, you know, that you can show that we have 70% of athletes are part of our union, let's say. How do you get those members and how do you keep them? Well, what we're finding and have found is that providing really, really relevant services and benefits to members is critical. Welfare services, education services, advice around integrity issues, match fixing and other integrity issues, legal advice around contracts, really, really important. That sort of business side type sort of services, very, very important. So that athletes who may not necessarily be overly interested in the political side of the union are still very much involved and engaged in the union because of the fact that the association or the commission is able to provide these services which they find relevant to their athletic lives.
Thanks a lot, Andy. I think these are very valuable insights for all of us, but especially for those people representing the athletes. So when we deal with this topic of interest representation, one natural reflex would be to think of conflict. So my next question would be to all the three of you, whether the relationship that you have with your main addressee, the sport governing body or the club association, who that ever may be, is it one of conflict or is it one of good partnership? Maybe Camille to kick us off.
Yeah, I'll start. Obviously for us, it's both. We are trade unions, so our main job is to negotiate working conditions. So that doesn't mean good condition, but that requires a dialogue. So it means that you are able to talk with the representatives of the clubs who are the employers of the football players. So I mean, it cannot only be fighting all the times, because you've got to build something. Otherwise, you will never manage to get new things or to protect the interest of the people that you're representing. So it has to be conditions of good dialogue to be able to reach something. But in the meantime, you also have sometimes problems that one player is facing with one club, and you have to do the job and to represent the player. So it's just to answer your question, basically it's both.
Okay, thanks. Alistair, your impression about the relationship between the IOC Ethics Commission and the IOC?
Yeah, well, it's not a technical independent body, so you sit within the IOC, and it's very collaborative, and I guess that's how it should be. Of course, there are issues that not everyone agrees on. Quite often, the disagreements can be internal between different parts of the commission, even different NSCs, for example. Might have different approaches. To go back to one of the big examples at the moment, the re-inclusion of Russian athletes in international sporting competitions, is, as you can imagine, quite significant differences in what people believe should happen, how it should happen, the requirements, all those kind of things. But ultimately, you have to come together and try and provide a solution that at least everyone isn't completely happy with, that everyone can live with. And I think if we look at use Rule 50 as an example, so Rule 50 is known as right to protest, and I think Rule 50 of the Olympic Charter, if we go back 3 or 4 years, would have allowed athletes to to be sanctioned for any type of political statement in almost any way during the Olympic Games. That was after consultation, for example, that changed significantly to you can make statements, certain type of statements, as long as it's not derogatory or inciting violence or disrespectful for your competition in certain areas, not on the field of play, for example, which, you know, I think most athletes, once it's explained to them, are really happy with, because no one wants another athlete to upset their competition by some kind of protest on the field of play. So I think it's coming to just sensible, collaborative solutions. And yeah, I've not come across a situation where it's not that.
Thank you, Tobias. So the question would also go into your direction about the relationship to your federation.
Yeah, I think that Finnish Athletics Federation, it's to us, it's also it's partner, but it's also a counterpart. I get an example that Finnish Athletics Federation represents clubs, and because clubs are members of federation, and athletes belong to clubs, so yeah, and all that. Federation also represent athletes. And I have to also get hat off to Finnish Athletics Federation. It has enabled a lot to us at this point. It has helped us, and I think that Finnish Athletics Federation has a great role, that we get such an excellent start only a year to this association. For example, Federation offered committee representation placements, which I thought previously, but also Federation is a counterpart to us. There will be things that we are on the different side compared to Federation. In that, we Federations are also counterpart. And for example, we have to negotiate with them of some issues, some points. And as a Federation board representative say to me that they are willing to challenge to us in our counterpart opinions. So with Federation, I have to summarize that we have a cooperation relation and diplomatical counterpartness. Until to this day, there are no things, or there are only little things where we are against Federation's opinion. But I'm sure that this kind of counter-opinion things will be increasing in the future. But in addition of Federation, I think the main counterpart to us are competition organizers. We have many counter-opinions with them. So, for example, the last autumn recorded the negotiations, the biggest Finnish track and field competition series called Motonet GB. Competition organizer did not notice at all our opinions and our membership poll results. They noticed a little bit our opinions when they defined the competition rewards, but not so well in event program proposals. So during the spring, we have a lot of negotiation with competition organizers with that. So yeah, to summarize, the Federation is a partner and counterpart, and I think the main counterpart are competition organizers, and the nearest partners are other athletics associations to us, like Finnish Football Association and Finnish Ice Hockey Association.
Thanks a lot. I think it just goes to show how different the organization of sport is and how many different facets there are to it. So we have talked a fair bit about processes of representing the athlete interest, but I also want to add some meat to the bone and go into the substance of the topics that you are representing on behalf of your members and the athletes. So Camille, in your opinion, what currently are the main topics where a stronger voice of the athletes needs to be heard in the organization of sport?
I was not prepared to that question.
I'm sorry.
No, I think what Alistair said about Rule 50 is a main topic in every sport, including the not most focused Olympic one, talking about men's football, for instance, and the legitimacy that the athletes and the football players themselves can have to speak about social problems and what happens into the society. Today, specifically in France, they mainly considered as only athletes. and not legitimate to have an opinion on anything else than their work. And even on that, not sure that they're considered as legitimate to have an opinion. So I think it's one of the main topics that we will and we are facing today, contribute to show people that athletes are not only athletes.
Thanks, Tobias. In your opinion, and maybe also in your in the daily work you do, what are the main issues?
Yeah, for our association aspect, for at the first part, this is a very new organization that some challenge. The one challenge point is when founder members like me and active members leaves the association board, how we can continue to this board. And we have recognized this point, and our strategy is to create so low threshold to as possible to join us and get an opinion to our decision making. And I think that's good playground to grow up new chair of boards and vice chair of boards to our association. So it's one key point that we have to call people as a low threshold to our board and get like a new vice board and vice chair of boards and chair of boards. A key point in this year will be external and internal communication and also a fundraising. And I think our members are very keen of also that promotion influence point, but especially when we organize some seminars, create instructions and promote athletes to practice their profession as athletes. For example, how to get sponsorship deals or something like that. So I think that we have to continue that last part also, include in addition of promotion interest point.
Thanks a lot. Alistair, you already mentioned some of the big topics, but is there anything else where you would see a strong involvement for the athletes in the near future or even in the present day?
I think I've mentioned the big topics, and you can probably guess the other ones. So the big ones in terms of the IOC consultations mentioned Rule 40. Rule 50 is the commercial rights and how athletes can interact with their own commercial sponsors and partners during the Olympic Games period. Consultation on that, and that was changed slightly to allow a bit more leeway to interact with commercial partners during the Olympic period. And for people who don't know about that, so the IOC has to be really strict with individuals and how they react they interact with their own potential commercial partners during the period, because they're obviously protecting the value of their rights. And without protecting the value of their rights, they wouldn't be able to raise the private funds to put on the Olympic Games. So that's another really difficult kind of balance to get right. And so that's happened. The really, I guess, the poignant one at the moment is the re-inclusion of Russian athletes. So for a bit more background on that, for people who didn't know, when Russia invaded Ukraine in early in 2022, just after the Beijing Winter Olympic Games, the IOC, along with most international federations, banned Russian athletes from competing in international competition. It's become very clear that this war is going to not go away overnight and is going to go on for a long time. And along with that, if you don't allow re-inclusion of Russian athletes into international competition within the next, I think, few months, if not 6 months, definitely during the summer season, it's a kind of de facto ban in terms of going to the Paris Games, because they can't qualify and go through the qualification period and criteria in different sports. So that pressure is really ramping up now of how Russian athletes, if they should be included and how they should be re-included. And the IOC has just launched, just within the last month, a massive consultation on if that should be done, how it should be done. And I guess some of the big bits of feedback from the Athlete Network on that, for an example, one bit of feedback was if you are going to re-include Russian athletes under a neutral flag, it has to be a stronger neutral flag than has existed in the past, such as in Tokyo and Beijing, because they're under neutral flag there because of doping violations, and and it didn't look very neutral to many athletes out there. People are particularly worried about anti-doping and whether the anti-doping has continued appropriately while Russians have been banned from international competition. And also one of the suggestions is because of visa issues for European countries, whether Russians should actually be able to qualify through the Asian continent network of competition. And that opens up an entire can of worms about quota spots and all kinds of things across different sports. And a lot of athletes have fed back that they don't think that's appropriate. And now IFs, international federations, are saying that that could be causing more problems than it's solving. So just an example of how athlete feedback, and that was actually fed back through, I was on a call of global athlete representatives that was live fed back to Thomas Bach himself as he was discussing this, and then all three of those points were mentioned in the IOC press release that came out last week on the issue. So really good example, I think, of kind of direct athlete representation and democracy right from levels that were discussed at the bottom level of representation of a British Olympic Association Athlete Commission, right up to going to Mr. Bach himself. So it works, and it was actually really good to see that. Other issues I think everyone can guess at. Anti-doping is always going to rumble on as an issue that's really important for all athletes, and people want to make sure that people get it right.
Thanks a lot also for really the insights into the daily work of the IOC Athletes Commission and the many things that develop. Before I open the floor for questions from our distinguished audience, I see people from all over the world in there, people with a lot of experience in the subject matter. I'd like to ask whether any of the panelists would like to react to a statement made by another panelist. All right, that seems not to be the case. Then I will ask the audience whether there are questions addressing our four speakers. All right, there is a question from Vanj. Forgive me if I pronounce it wrong. Are there any thoughts on esports athletes as part of this whole discussion? Anyone wanting to taking this question? Maybe Andy, in your research, did you consider esport athletes? Just a brief insight here in Germany, there was recently founded an athletes association for esport players. Obviously an association, not a trade union, but from what you've done throughout the last years?
No, the short answer to that is no, we didn't. We've not looked at esports in our research. I mean, there's also the big debate is whether or not esports are in fact really a sport at all. I mean, this is perhaps a philosophical debate. My colleagues in Prague University are doing quite a lot of work with this and being quite influential, I think, with the authorities about whether esports can be properly thought of as a sport. There might be something else that has similar issues, but I think, and I just wonder really what the athletes think about that. In terms of whether or not whether esports should be thought of and brought into sort of the sporting family, or whether really esports is quite a different sort of activity altogether.
Good question to our panelists. Alistair, obviously that's also a big topic for the IOC to consider. And how far is the Athletes Commission or the EOC Athlete Commission considering it?
So I think there's two issues there. The first one is what kind of, let's not get into the rabbit hole of the debate of whether it's a sport or not, but what kind of events should be included in the future Olympic program? obviously there's this fantastic philosophical question of how far should the IOC keep on moving away from traditional sports, and how much of the value of the Olympic Games and the Olympic movement is in tradition and the events itself. I keep using the example that you can't shorten the marathon to make it more interesting for viewers. It wouldn't work. But at the same time, how should we include modern interactive sports that a younger generation might want to interact with, follow more, watch more, etc., which drives the whole thing in terms of the rights holders and the value for rights. So I think so I think that's the first issue, that the inclusion in future programs. And I know the IOC are testing this with the OVS. There's so many things to remember, but yeah. So the Olympic Virtual Series, of which the first is going to be in Singapore, and looking at inclusion of esports in the Olympic movement. So yeah, and I think that's interesting. I think there's just a really good balance to be found there. And esports is a wide thing. It includes everything from computer games, which are completely static, to bike racing on a computer game in the terms of Zwift and various other things. So there's quite a range of things there, potentially included, some which you might consider proper sports, I guess, if you want to define it as that. In terms of athlete representation, yeah, absolutely. I think anywhere where there is a professional league or athletes are competing at high level, there should be forms of representation, independent and not independent, however you want to look at it. And I think I've always looked at athlete representation as kind of three key tenets, and if you need those, I guess, whether it's esports or Olympic sport or anything else, there needs to be representation. And I think if you look at those, one of the main one of those is it's a practical tenet, and if it's ultimately the workplace of professional athletes or very elite level athletes. And so if it's the workplace, you evidently need a pretty strong say in what's going on. Obviously, another one is governance, being a key stakeholder. And I've always thought of the third one as a more philosophical one, which is the point I already made about being a representative of the wider Olympic movement.
Thanks a lot. So there was another question directed to Camille. It was mentioned, and you also spoke about legitimacy, but as a union that represents 2,000 athletes playing for different clubs from different countries, is sometimes a challenge to get engagement from all athletes. Is there anything that UNFP does to ensure engagement?
Yeah, it is definitely a daily challenge. And it is, it's the big part of our job is, as I said earlier, to make sure that we know who we represent. And that's what Andy mentioned also about how do we do it on daily work. And inside UNFP, we organized with different employees whose job is to know the players. And they are kind of, they only work with players from some clubs around where they live, so that we make sure that we keep having proximity with the players and we know them. And I think this is the best answer that we can have today on how we make sure that we are legitimate to represent them. Just make sure that we really talk to them as often as we can. I hope that answered the question.
Thanks a lot. I just remember a quote that I read from Ben Haas. He must be a colleague of Alistair in the VOA Ethics Commission. He said, athletes are rubbish at answering to anything. Whenever they launched a survey or a poll or a consultation process, I just came across that. So that, yeah, I imagine it being a huge challenge, continuing and keeping it up, the engagement of all the athletes. There is one question from Borja Garcia. Is athlete representation by the IOC or IFs just co-optation the way it is currently structured? That probably goes to everyone. I don't know, maybe Alistair, as you are a member of the IOC's Athletes Commission, what would your reaction be to that?
I mean, you could argue this both ways. I truly believe in the kind of collaborative approach here of working. Ultimately, whether it's IF or the IOC, these organisations, they really exist for a load of reasons, I'd say, but they exist to put on events for athletes, to provide great sporting opportunities for athletes, and increase the global presence of the sports, for people to watch, for more people to compete, and for the inspirational and motivational effect of sport. As I keep mentioning, that's a big part of the Olympic movement. There is this kind of issue of, I guess, kind of amateurism and non-professionalism, which obviously a lot of the Olympic IFs are kind of in, and a lot of the sports are kind of professionalizing quite fast, which I think is probably why you haven't seen a lot of independent type trade union bodies, because the issues of kind of finance, commercial, I guess, working conditions haven't needed an independent body, or some people might argue they have, but it just hasn't been important yet. But no, I actually don't believe it's co-optation. I think it's a collaborative approach. I like to think actually it's not kind of, as you'd imagine, as of a trade union approach sometimes, of athletes on one side of a table and an IF on the other. Ultimately, people are in it together, where the athletes are the major stakeholder there, and the best way of representing them in the heart of the organisation is through democratic process, an athletes commission, and that being represented up to the top in terms of executive board level. And I think your point from Ben, and I know Ben well, is really true. Actually, a lot of the time, to be honest, when athletes are in the throes of their career, they tend to be super focused on what they're doing. You tend to be super focused on the short term. You tend to be a bit younger. And for a lot of my career, I didn't really care about the kind of governance and representation in sport. So yeah, it is. I've got lots of experience of trying to get athletes to vote on something or input on something, and it just doesn't happen. And you tend to find people it's very polarized. Basically, 90% of people aren't interested at all, and 10% of people are very interested. And so representing the wider community can be tough. And I think doing that in the right way is being collaborative and working with people, and rather than trying to kind of work for different conditions.
Thanks. Any further opinion? Or maybe I kind of elaborate on that point. So if the representation in decision-making structures, if athletes there have one voice among many stakeholders, how do we ensure that they are effectively represented if it is inclusion in decision-making structures where, for example, elected representatives of the sport governing bodies have 10 votes versus 1 or 2 votes from the athletes?
Is that for me?
For anyone who's willing to respond.
So I think to give a bit of a background on that, an IF governing body could be 8 or plus. I actually don't know what a lot of them are. I think triathlon might be 10 people, maybe not 10, maybe 8 people on their executive board, of which 1 is the chair of the athlete commission. So that's how the athletes are represented there. So I think the question of this question is going, well, is that effective representation for a key stakeholder if there's only 1 out of 8 or whatever that is representing at the exec board and decision-making level? And it's similar. So on the IOC, the chair of the IOC Athletes Commission, Emma Terrero, is a member of the IOC executive board as well. So that's the governance structure there, and that's the guidelines that the IOC use for their IFs and NOCs around the world. I haven't seen many situations, I guess, where that doesn't work in terms of effective representation. So yeah, in terms of the numbers, yeah, for sure, but that's presuming that the other executive board members don't listen to an athlete perspective, aren't ex-athletes themselves, don't really care about the sport and athletes as key stakeholders, which in my experience most people involved in sports governance probably do.
Andy.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, just going back to Borja's question about co-optation, I think it's really important. And from my experience with working with some of the athlete associations, there appears to be sort of three perspectives on this point. For some, athlete commissions are very much seen as a barrier to effective athlete representation because they're being set up by sports governing bodies as a means of being able to manage the athlete representative process rather than engaging with the independent collective voice of a trade union. So in some cases there's a relationship of antipathy between the independent free trade union and the athlete commission because of this view that they're being used as a means of evading, if you like, the ability of the trade unions to negotiate. So that's one view. Another view was that athlete commissions are a bit irrelevant on the grounds that they don't have any members and they don't have a lot of resources and they're therefore not really able to do the athlete representative work anyway. And then in the middle, there's I think a more productive ground. And I think Alistair's really sort of discussed it extremely well. That there's a role of the internal representative structures of athletes commissions to be able to take up all those issues inside the organization in this collaborative way, providing that the rights of the collective trade unions are also recognized to negotiate in an independent way on all the issues that trade unions negotiate on terms and conditions of employment, on the status of employees, on social security, on workload and so on, and along with the integrity issues. So I think there's a path forward where both these models can coexist, but there has to be goodwill, I think, on all sides to try to make that happen. Which of course is part of the reason what we're trying to do in our project to start that process. So I think it's really interesting, and I think there is obviously tensions there, but I think they are resolvable, at least partially.
Thank you very much, Andy. Camille, Tobias, any further thoughts on these two issues that we touched upon?
Just for your information, in men's professional football, representative athletes have 2 seats out of 25.
Okay, yeah. I think that's more than in Germany even. Tobias, from your perspective, how do we deal with the issue? Or just to get the facts straight, so there is no athletes commission in Finnish track and field. Is this correct? So you are the sole representative organ towards the federation of the athletes' voice.
Yeah. There's no commission. There's our independent association, which represents. And as I said earlier, we have a representation in 5 Finnish Athletics Association committees, and now 1 in the Finnish Athletics Association board, and we get the second place during later on this year. So, yep.
Okay, thanks a lot. So there is one more question from Ekain. Have any of you followed the process of increasing athlete representation within WADA? I'm sure you all did. So what would your opinions be on the final outcomes of the WADA reform process? Maybe we start with Camille this time.
Yeah, it's a bit complicated for trade union, as we obviously are not going to be directly involved, but I think every athlete's organization's goal in this kind of topic is to make sure that athletes' voice is heard. So the conditions and the requirements that we were talking about earlier on effective representations, I'm not sure that they're properly respected in this new WADA organization, and including the legitimacy and the independence. So maybe we need to wait and see how things go in the future.
Yep, I think this relates to this question a little bit indirectly, but we have a representation in Finnish Athletics Association in ethical panel, which do cooperation with Finnish Athletics Ethical Center, which do cooperation in WADA. So yeah, this is how our association represents in the field a question what WADA handles.
Yeah, Elsa, I see you already unmuted.
Yeah, I must admit, I don't know as much about it as I should. I know that they've increased the numbers of the athlete board quite a lot. I know it's made up, I think, of 3 or 4 members of the IOC Athletes Commission. And outside that, was there about another 3 different tranches of ways of athletes could be included, which seemed quite complicated, to be honest. But outside that, I had a brief look at doing it and decided it looked quite complicated, and I was already doing it through the IOC route. So I must admit that's my entire knowledge, and I should know more, but I don't. I think in general, I think athlete representation is good. I think probably I can't think of anywhere where it's more important than anti-doping, to be honest. One of the things we often forget about anti-doping, it's obviously its aim is to be a deterrent and to catch cheats and deter potential cheats from doping. But I also think the athlete voice is really, really important because there's it can become really overbearing, complicated, really kind of restrictive at times on athletes' lives. It can be confusing for young athletes. There's actually quite a lot of information to learn and be on top of, and you have to be quite organized. And I think that's kind of the side of anti-doping that sometimes obviously doesn't get talked about a lot, as well as false positive tests and the massive, obviously, psychological and issues of people falling foul of the system innocently. And so, yeah, I find it tough to think of an area where athletes' voices really shouldn't be heard louder, to be honest, than anti-doping.
Right. Yeah, thanks a lot. I think the question that Lorenz posed as a follow-up question to Ekain's more general question has already been addressed a bit by Camille. And the issue, I think, is quite at hand, that there are athletes that are represented through independent organizations, but especially in the Olympic movement, it is difficult for them to find foot and to make their voices heard through their collective organization. That was also pointed out by the independent recommendations report for an IOC human rights strategy from Rachel Davis and Prince Said Rad Al Hussein. So any opinions on what the future of athletes representation might look like to overcome this difference and the conflict, if there is one, between athletes that are represented in independent associations or trade unions and those who are not, and which rely on the voice of the athletes' commissions as an internal organization? Is it a complementary role? Does one have to go eventually? And if so, which one should prevail? Yes, Camille.
Yeah, I'll go first for this one because, as I said earlier, I agree with what the conclusions were that were presented by Andy, and I think they should be complementary. In fact, it's different jobs. You both represent athletes, but with at the end you've got the same goal, but you have different means and you have different tools to do it. So I think it should be complementary. And one of the problems that we are facing today is that it is often presented as opposed, having the truly legitimate and the not completely independent. And I think it's a mistake to make this simple opposition between these representation of athletes that should be complementary.
Thank you. I saw, Tobias, you also raised your hand.
Yes, Andy presented at the first part that the first part or the prior organization form is the association like that. And as I said earlier, I'm on the association side of this question, but I think also that commissions has also a complementary role if association for some reason this is not possible to create or something like that. But for a prior role, I think the association is a better form to represent in athletics in now and in the future. Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Alistair, how do you see the future of athlete representation with those two forms of representing the athletes?
I see in the Olympic movement, I probably can't speak too much for outside of that. I'd say very much continuing on the path we're on of inclusive and cooperation between a internal athlete commission within organisations, NOCs, IFs, and International Olympic Committee. I could see those being expanded in terms of their probably in some extent the executive role as well as the non-exec role. I sometimes wonder whether that is more of an issue than representation on the board. But I think I know someone put it in the chat, but the US have increased their quota for athlete representation, have been leaders at this for quite a long time. But I think increased representation on boards and increased dialogue with the exec teams of organisations is what I see happening in the future.
All right. Andy, obviously you presented on it in the very beginning, but any additional thoughts that you would like to share from your perspective?
Not really. I think everything's been said, but I do really believe there is this complementary roles to be had. I suspect we'll see a growth in athletes commissions because it's kind of delivering on some of the codes of good governance in sport that are in place. And in terms of associations, of course, it's ultimately the desire of athletes to form an athlete association that's critical there, and the ability to do so and to represent themselves collectively in that independent body. So I think there are these sort of two. I think as Camille's put it perfectly. There's these two very different organisations with different functions, albeit where they overlap at times. And I think just working out where each can sit in the system athlete representation will be critical. But the desire and willingness of athletes to get involved and to want to be represented, I think, is something that we shouldn't overlook.
Thanks a lot. There is one more question that I have in the chat from Dev. Question to everyone. Does the panel think that there should be a cap on athlete represented by the representatives? Anyone willing to take it first?
What do you mean by a cap?
Dev, if you're still with us, you are, of course, allowed to unmute yourself, but I'm not sure if he still is.
I'm not quite sure what the question, what it's trying to get at.
Yeah.
I mean, if it means, should there be a limit to the number of organisations that represent athletes? We've currently got unions, we've got athletes commissions. There's also, as we know, some informal bodies that have been set up, with outside of both commissions and unions. So there is a danger of a proliferation of representative organisations that might actually weaken athlete representative voice rather than focusing it. So I think if that's the question, then I think there's a point behind it. So yeah, I think we need to be careful about how, particularly about organisations that are set up without athlete members, and they do exist and claim to represent athletes, and so I think we have to be careful about that. So I'd go back to this issue about the principles, which are very much about making sure, whether you're a union or a commission, that you really are sure you're representing the collective view of members to the best of your abilities. It's always an imperfect science, and to ensure you've got systems and processes and practices in place to be able to do that.
Yeah, thanks, Andy. I think, Tobias, you also raised your hand very briefly to this question.
Yeah, if I understand right, this kind of question, how, for example, our association relate to questions or issues which not consider our core action or something like that. And this is interesting because our membership and potential membership are international track and field athletes, also near of international level in track and field athletes. And we have discussed that we do not block the things which are not core things of our playground. For example, ethical issues or something like that. Consider all kind of athletes that does not depend on your athletics level. But yeah, I think we have to focus on the near of international track and field athletes issues because it's our core action and they are main issues for us. But good question.
Right. So thanks a lot. So we have already passed 7 o'clock Central European time. Andy, for you, it's a bit earlier. I would like to thank all of you, especially the 4 of you, but also everyone who contributed to the discussion with questions. Obviously, I think we see that there are many difficult questions. There are large concepts that require specific solutions in our today's sport governance. And then there is many topics, obviously, where the voice of athletes is a very important one to being heard. I thank all 4 of you for the work that you do. Personally, I am deeply convinced that the future of the governance of sport cannot be imagined without a strong voice for athletes. So thanks a lot, and especially for taking your time for making this event a success for the Sport&EU Association. This topic of athlete representation will remain on the agenda of the association. It will certainly come up during our annual conference in Lisbon. Feel kindly invited. If today's talk was an inspiration for you to delve deeper into the topic, you can still submit an abstract even for the conference until February the 15th. And we will definitely continue hosting such events as today with many different topics and many distinguished speakers. Thank you very much. I wish you all a good night later on, and we will continue the work on behalf and for the athletes. Thank you very much.